When you think about Charlotte County, Florida, perhaps the first thing that comes to mind is affordable coastal living. But in 2024, our YouTube channel embarked on a mission to show you the side of Charlotte County, Florida that no one had ever seen. Literally entire shanty towns and communities of people living clandestinely in wooded areas that covered hundreds of acres in the South Sarasota and Charlotte County region. This series on Charlotte County alone reached over 2 million views on our YouTube channel. And the only thing more shocking than the living conditions of the homeless in these camps is the stories of abuse by the Charlotte County Sheriff's Office.
Everyone's telling the same exact story despite who they are, where they come from, whatever. So there's got to be some kind of truth to it.
Apparently there was a trespass, but I never saw an actual trespass anything. And I'm pretty sure when you get a trespass, you have to sign a document. They never presented me a paper. They showed me one of their phones that took a picture of a piece of the paper with our names on it. And some random person paid my entire bail, like the whole 500.
Somebody bailed you out.
Yeah, and I don't know who they were.
And at the time, we felt that the only thing we really could do was give the homeless people a voice and to vent their frustrations about some of the abuses that they were facing in their community. Most people in Charlotte County, Florida couldn't imagine that in the tree line behind their neighborhoods were hundreds of encampments of people, many of whom were disabled and elderly, living clandestinely in the woods, and on top of that being harassed, threatened, and practically being unlawfully detained by law enforcement under investigation methods that are illegal. But lately, the abuses from law enforcement on the homeless and other agencies has started to unravel. See, at the time when we first started to cover these stories, it was nothing but word of mouth, stories of crooked cops. These officers were literally taking the homeless hostage and forcing them to divulge information on the whereabouts of other individuals under the threat of arrest or harm. Many of these individuals had mental health crises and other personal issues that forced them to seek seclusion in a homeless camp so they could work out their personal issues. These aren't exactly criminals. We ran into people that were elderly, disabled, mentally impaired, individuals who were just going through a rough time. These individuals will then find themselves in a homeless camp being forced to do things against their will under the threat of law enforcement. These officers would find a homeless camp in the middle of the woods in a large compound, and they would surround this homeless camp, which was an artery leading into other trails where hundreds of homeless camps existed. Some of these areas are hundreds of acres large. On arriving to these places, they would tell the homeless people that they were all being arrested for trespassing. Many times the officers would also threaten the people, putting tasers to their chests, telling them that they were all going to be arrested for trespassing. After threatening the homeless people with their body cam footage turned off, they would then tell the homeless people that they'd let them go if they would just find a particular person that was living somewhere in a homeless camp. They would take some of the homeless people hostage and send a few others out to get the information. Thus, the hard work of going into these homeless camps that are dangerous to find a particular person was put upon the responsibility of a homeless person who is now being forced to unlawfully enact a warrant or the search of a person with a warrant under the threat of being arrested or of harm being caused to the other homeless people that were being kidnapped by officers back at the homeless camp. 4 Charlotte County officers were fired under an investigation by Internal Affairs. However, in reality, these officers should be getting arrested for violation of one of the most serious statutes in the state of Florida, that of unlawfully detaining somebody without cause. These officers, in a sense, became the landlords of these homeless camp, exacting rent from these individuals for being able to live clandestinely in these improvised camps. Basically, these officers were exacting from the homeless that they could live clandestinely in these camps as long as they cooperated with helping the cops find people who had warrants. Any homeless person who would thus live in these homeless camps would pretty much be paying rent to these police officers by having to help them make detentions of people who had warrants or When the police officers needed to make a detention for a high-profile case, they would go to the homeless camp and demand that somebody turn themselves in voluntarily for committing the crime. By being able to make many detentions and apprehensions easily, it appeared that these officers were doing exceptional police work, but in reality, the brutality of their scheme would be unraveled by the now mounting accusations of the homeless people protesting the inhumane conditions that these officers were creating for them, practically taking them hostage in exchange for being able to live on land that these officers didn't even own. Thus, the officers were able to create a situation where when they needed somebody to be arrested, they could easily come up with an apprehension, whether it be finding somebody that had a warrant or finding somebody to take culpability for a crime they didn't commit. The officers were on paper looking like they were excelling at law enforcement, but in reality, they were running a racket where they were practically taking an entire homeless community hostage. I knew something was up in Charlotte County, Florida when we started to see the arrest of many of the people who I've interviewed on my YouTube channel recently. Practically almost every single homeless person that I've interviewed in Charlotte County, Florida who has talked on this subject has recently been arrested, showing that police officers are trying to retaliate on the homeless people who helped me make these videos exposing the reality of life in these homeless camps. This is William Butler, the gangster. His video alone reached nearly 800,000 people. His makeshift home in the woods of Charlotte County, Florida, and his poetic rhymes reached the hearts of hundreds of thousands of people. However, he was arrested by Charlotte County sheriff's officers on an onslaught of criminal offenses related to drug charges. His arrest was also deleted from the Charlotte County website so that nobody could see that he was arrested. One of the biggest tools that these officers used to extort these homeless people to do whatever they wanted was the fact that they were voiceless. But when a platform comes around and gives people the opportunity to have hundreds of thousands and millions of people to hear their voices, the dynamics of power had changed, and now any abuse that the law enforcement officers committed against the homeless would have the opportunity to at least be heard by a general audience. Another person that we interviewed in Charlotte County, Florida, who's recently been arrested is this young man right here. While on the video, we edited out the part where he talked about the abuses he faced. You could clearly tell that behind the cameras, me and him had talked about some of the abuses they were facing in this county. While we're not going to go on with the list of every single homeless person that's recently been arrested that I've interviewed in this county, it became very clear that anybody who came in contact with my YouTube channel would soon be arrested in Charlotte County, Florida. The latest event happened here in Englewood, Florida, where there's a hospital surrounded by a homeless camp. Now, usually the homeless people that live near a hospital are going to be the ones that need constant medical attention. The existence of homeless camps within the vicinity of hospitals is a story I've chosen not to cover in the state of Florida because these are really the most vulnerable homeless people, and it is here in a homeless camp adjacent to a hospital in Englewood, Florida, where the police officers entered a homeless camp with their body cam footage turned off, looking to arrest a homeless woman who had a warrant. Here, they went with the same program. Now, allegedly, this story unfolded back in February. Unfortunately, this isn't the only occurrence of this situation. It seemed like these police officers were systematically using this as protocol. Whenever they needed to make an arrest in a homeless camp, they would just walk into a camp and demand that somebody find the person they were looking for, or those people would be arrested for trespassing. Whenever officers carry out an arrest of somebody for a warrant, they have to have their body cam footage turned on before they even exit the vehicle. However, in the case of these officers in Charlotte County, Florida, that's not when the body cam footages were turned on. They were trying to conceal the fact that they were being lazy by extorting the homeless people for information off camera, enabling them to bypass due process and literally just extort information from people who are unrelated to the arrest warrant. These officers being terminated is an unprecedented landmark for the rights of homeless people in Southwest Florida. For too long, inept police officers assumed that they could strip away these people's due process, and because they're indigent, defenseless, poor, and homeless, that nobody in the community would stand up for the rights of these people. As many people like myself and others are now pulling body cam footage of arrests of the homeless in Florida.
Alfredo, time to wake up, we got a warrant. Yep, we're gonna go to jail. goes literally by your head. Crack ain't gonna be in here, is it?
It's prompted police officers to be aware that when they're dealing with somebody who's homeless or indigent, that they don't have the right to strip these people of their due process and that there will be accountability. This has prompted scrutiny of many law enforcement agencies in Southwest Florida to clearly evaluate how they're treating the homeless people when they're being arrested, now that they know that accountability has to take place when dealing with individuals who are indigent. This body cam footage that we're looking at right now was the first person arrested in Florida after the enactment of the new homeless laws by the governor of Florida. The Manatee County Sheriff's Office is among the many agencies who are refusing to arrest homeless people under the state's new homeless law. At this point, no agency in the state of Florida has actually arrested homeless people under this new law that the governor signed, choosing to continue to cite the homeless people for trespassing or municipal ordinances and not the state law, which many of these agencies believe is a law that they would rather not enforce because they don't agree with it. I don't know if you guys know this, but many law enforcement agencies in Florida silently protested the state's new homeless law by taking 2 or 3 days where they committed 0 homeless arrests. There are many law enforcement agencies in Florida who stopped arresting homeless people for 2 to 3 days, silently protesting the fact that they were not going to participate in the state's new homeless laws. These law enforcement agencies decided that it was them in their own counties and their own agencies who's going to determine by due process how they are going to arrest the homeless. Some of these body cam footages that we have ordered have revealed some very important pieces of information in the rights of the homeless people in Florida. Take a very close look at this clip right here.
Lodging outdoors, which is prohibited in the city of Sarasota. To avoid being arrested or summoned to appear in court, you may be transported to an available shelter by an officer. The shelter will be the Salvation Army. At the shelter, you will be provided a bed for 24 hours at no cost. During this time, you will not be required to attend class, religious ceremonies, counseling, or treatment.
So in theory, all a homeless person has to do is just simply go to a shelter and they won't be arrested. However, we've noted that many homeless people would rather go to jail than end up in these shelters.
We have offered many times for resources. I just offered to meet you at the Salvation Army, but you don't want to. So stay by the court.
Have you ever wondered why the homeless people tell stories about being abused at these shelters? Law enforcement agencies deny these claims. However, recently a doctor was arrested in Sarasota, Florida. He was supposed to be helping vulnerable victims recover from trauma and pain. However, he was actually taking advantage of the people he was supposed to be helping. With this arrest in Sarasota County, it only highlights that these shelters and treatment centers that the state of Florida is offering the homeless as an alternative to incarceration, or actually even more dangerous than incarceration themselves. Many homeless people note that at least in the jail, they're surrounded by other people, but when they get transferred to these homeless shelters and some of these programs, they find that they're very vulnerable, many times being abused. Even more disappointing is widespread reports from the homeless that at these shelters, when a case of abuse does take place from staff or from other homeless residents, that these agencies try to cover up these events because they're afraid it may get in the way of their funding. In the United States, if somebody who's in a religious organization discovers that some type of abuse has taken place, they are required by law, without any exception, to file a report on these instances. However, many of these organizations do not file these reports with local law enforcement agencies because they're afraid that it may taint their reputation or it get in the way of their resources.
Well, what caused me to leave Pinellas Hope, okay, I became friends with a woman there, and we were friends. Okay, and she tried to sit there and say something about it. They kept trying to sweep it under the rug, saying she was crazy.
Yeah.
And because of me, when I believe in something, I don't keep my mouth shut.
Yeah.
So that's what caused me to kick out.
and they force these people into some degraded site. Like you go to homeless shelters or homeless prevention places, and if you don't fit the right demographic, they try to pigeonhole you into it so that they make more money from the federal stinking government. And you want to know what? When you go in there, 95% of the people in there have some kind of tendency to homosexuality. And that is because I've been there and watched it.
Mira, si quiere una cama en el shelter, no puedo llevar por allá.
¿Para dónde?
El Salvation Army.
Mira, Salvation Army, si botaron a toda esa gente de ahí y limpiaron y pusieron gente buena, es negocio.
I offered him a bed at the Salvation Army. He said that place is what was the exact words he used? A shit shelter. And that they need to change all their staff there and make it a better place. I said, well, I know that's what you think, but that's the only other option. But you need to get up and get it out of here.
Just 2 days ago, Capricornio TV from the Dominican Republic did a series on homelessness in Miami, Florida. The homeless there noted that they would rather go to jail than a homeless shelter in Miami-Dade County. The state of Florida promoted its new homeless law as ethical treatment because they offered people the option of going to a homeless shelter or treatment center as an alternative to being arrested. However, we've already seen that these places are scary, dangerous, and many times the people that manage these places are actually abusing the homeless in different ways. When we first started to cover the injustices that the homeless were facing in Southwest Florida, many people said that my videos were part of a liberal agenda. However, it's Bill Pummel himself, the Charlotte County Sheriff, who denounced the actions of these officers, confirming that our stories about lack of due process with the handling of the homeless situation in Florida were not made-believe stories. These were the real-life encounters that the homeless have been having with law enforcement. On top of that, the option that they're given to avoid being incarcerated are places that are known for abuse. When it comes to the abuses of homeless people by law enforcement, homeless shelters, and organizations that are supposed to be helping them, this is only the tip of the iceberg of some of the things that they're going through. Many times I've had to omit sections of interviews because the details are too graphic for YouTube. During an interview of a young couple in North Central Florida, you could hear a woman screaming in the background that if I wanted a story, she had one for me. During the interview, you can make out the commotion as other homeless people dragged her away from the interview site so that I can continue my interview. She claimed that officers were arresting her and then letting her get out in exchange for favors. Not long after this interview, an officer was actually arrested in North Central Florida for doing the exact thing. These officers have been entrusted with protecting and serving our communities. However, what they're actually doing is taking advantage of the most vulnerable and weak people in our community, those who are homeless and indigent, and submitting them to some of the worst treatment imaginable. The homeless people have been labeled as individuals who are continually on the wrong side of the law by choice. However, we've also proven that the options that we've given them are actually worse than going to jail. This has driven many homeless people, not by choice, but by no other option, to choose a life of crime, knowing very well that the options that society is giving them leaves them in a very dangerous and vulnerable situation. Despite the state's efforts in claiming that it has found a practical solution for homelessness, many people who are housed are not far from being homeless themselves. And when they do become homeless, they'll find out that the stories of abuse, misappropriation, and people taking advantage of their vulnerability are not just far-fetched stories, but the reality of being homeless in the state of Florida, a place that on the surface claims to have a solution to every problem, but in reality, the moment you become homeless in the state of Florida, you find out that your rights no longer exist. These recent news stories highlight the authenticity of the work that we have been doing on our YouTube channel to bring you guys credible stories. In the past, when the homeless here didn't have a voice, many people felt that they could get away with anything upon this community. But now that we have used our platform and given the microphone to people on the streets and given them a chance to tell those stories, people are going to have to think twice about taking advantage of our homeless people.
Watch all this stuff this morning.
That's all I got.
Man, stop lying, nigga. Stop lying, bro. I'll put your hole through your fucking chest, bitch. I swear to God.
On our YouTube channel, we have also documented how dangerous these homeless shelters can be. Fights, stabbings, and even shootings happen at these homeless shelters because these homeless shelters in Southwest Florida are open-air markets. Many times there are armed, masked people right in the outskirts of these homeless shelters. It's understandable that homeless people would avoid these places. It's understandable that Florida's homeless population would rather go to jail than to a homeless shelter, and nobody deserves to be incarcerated simply for being homeless. And even worse, the people who we entrusted to help the homeless appear to be taking advantage of them. Of course, that doesn't mean that every single person in these positions of responsibility is doing things the wrong way. We've also covered many stories of people going above and beyond to help people that are homeless.
Austin, actually, the coolest cop out in Jacksonville. He was nice. He got us tested.
So if you notice, she said some cops will come and they'll slice your tent so you have to leave. And other cops, with their own money, will put you in a hotel to help you. So you can't just generalize that all police are against homeless people.
Monday, how many days was it? He paid $350.
Yeah, he paid for 3 nights for us.
To help
so that
you.
we could take showers.
So you guys, there are officers who out of their own money.
That's the only one we found.
Cool.
Officer Sealoss.
Yeah.
His jurisdiction was actually right there off of Moore's.
And I was in the trash can in the middle of the day looking for her phone because Google said it was there.
Yeah.
And he actually told me to climb out of the dumpster, and I climbed out, and he said, "We need more people like you out here helping friends."
Yeah.
And he handed me a $50 bill.
The cop gave you a $50
Yes,
bill?
yes, with a little prayer card.
Awesome.
Yes.
So not all police officers are bad out here.
No.
It wasn't that long ago that in Charlotte County, Florida, Officer Diaz was killed by an armed homeless person. It's clear that the tensions between the homeless and law enforcement in Charlotte County, Florida is one tense situation that only seems to get worse. Homelessness can really happen to just about anybody. No matter how wealthy you are or how well off you are, your life can change in an instant. Most of us probably can't do anything to change the homeless situation of a lot of people in our community, but we can at least treat them respectfully. Nobody deserves to be punished simply for being poor. And unfortunately, in Charlotte County, Florida, we've seen more than once the results of the frustration of the homeless community. The story of the homeless person who killed Officer Diaz is a reminder that for many homeless people, they have absolutely nothing to lose. This is a sad reality of homelessness in Florida, and while most police officers do everything they can to treat the homeless people with dignity and respect, it's important to address the issue of law enforcement officers who've been depleting the homeless population of due process, so much so that it gives the entire agency a bad reputation. And remember that none of us are exempt from becoming homeless. Many people excuse the way they treat the homeless people by saying that they're all a bunch of addicts and that they all cause crime and trouble in our community. But let's not forget that by bullying these people and by treating them badly, we only prolong their suffering. We should encourage the homeless to be better, make them feel like they're part of our society so they can come back and get away from the streets. For many people, their mental state will never allow them to be normal, and it's a real injustice that our society has by default placed people with mental discapacity as individuals who are on the wrong side of the law, not because they want to be. Many of these people were orphaned, abused from childhood, and they haven't been given the same opportunities that some of us have. Many people just like to assume that the homeless population are a bunch of criminals and addicts that chose to be like this. But I've learned with my experiences that many of these individuals have had a bad displacement from the time they were born, and that it isn't by choice that they're in these situations. Most officers are aware of that situation, and even though they carry out their jobs of arresting the homeless people, they do it with respect and dignity, knowing very well that these individuals have been abused since childhood, victims of a worthless foster care system that only makes their situation worse. As a society, we have really failed the homeless. And while it is true that many of them engage in illicit activities that only prolong their situation on the streets, we can't ignore the fact that for the most part, many of the people that are homeless today, it isn't because they failed society, it's because we failed them.